Chapter 12, Indoctrination and Subordination, page 391. The wisdom from above is in the first place pure, and then peace-loving, considerate, and open to reason. It is straightforward and sincere, rich in mercy and in the kindly deeds that are its fruit. James, chapter 3 verse 17, New English Bible. A common characteristic of mass movements in general is that they express keen concern for the individual and the individual's interests. Yet, paradoxically, they usually produce a subordination of the individual, a discouragement of individual thinking. Conformity and uniformity are urged as crucial for the success of the movement, for its progress and growth. The individual has no importance except as he or she contributes to the success of the movement. All interests and all thinking must be subordinated to that goal. The Watchtower Society has made forceful statements about subordination and indoctrination, in two different ways. One is with regard to information coming from outside sources. The other is with regard to acceptance of the information it itself provides. This unequal standard leads to a paradox like that described above. The power to resist indoctrination. During the past half-century, Jehovah's Witnesses have made a notable record in resisting brainwashing techniques, particularly on the part of totalitarian systems, such as Nazism, that have tried to indoctrinate them with their ideologies. The January 1, 1959, issue of the Watchtower magazine presented this quotation about their record, pages 15, 16. A book published in the British Isles in 1957, called Battle for the Mind, A Physiology of Conversion and Brainwashing, said, those reported as among the best able to preserve their standards and beliefs in the German concentration camps during World War II were members of the sect of Jehovah's Witnesses. This pacifist religious group has many strange beliefs, but these were implanted with such strength and certainty by their religious leaders as to remain operative when continued debilitation and psychological degradation had reduced most other people of the highest ideals, but no specific loyalties, to accept the very lowest conception of individual and group morality. A safeguard against conversion is indeed a burning and obsessive belief in some other creed or way of life. History shows that well-indoctrinated and trained soldiers can be just as brave and stubborn as Jehovah's Witnesses. In the infamous concentration camps, as in labor camps and in prisons, and in the face of persecution in other forms, Jehovah's Witnesses have shown a very high resistance to political indoctrination. Having personally lived through periods of intense adverse public feeling and pressure, mob violence, and life-threatening situations, and having witnessed what it is like to live under a dictatorial government, I have no doubt as to the intensity of devotion of Jehovah's Witnesses generally in facing such stressful trials. I know how I felt, and I believe I know how most of them feel in such times of testing. The footnote reads, see Crisis of Conscience, pages 11 to 20. End of footnote. Note, however, that the source the above Watchtower item quotes makes the valid point that others besides Jehovah's Witnesses can and have displayed resistance to brainwashing with comparable success, including well-indoctrinated and trained soldiers. Thus it is often a case of one indoctrination versus another. At times both may be of a political or nationalistic origin, or they may both be of a religious nature, or views stemming from one of these sources may be pitted against views originating with one of the others. Mere ability to resist, then, does not guarantee that the strength of the resistance necessarily springs from scriptural convictions about the rightness or wrongness of certain actions. People in the past as in the present have been willing to undergo severe trials while holding to beliefs very different from and sometimes opposite to what Jehovah's Witnesses hold. History shows that people have at times been willing to sacrifice their lives to be obedient to a certain leadership, even when calm thought would show that that leadership was far removed from the example of Jesus Christ. The basis for one's beliefs, the means by which one came to be governed by those beliefs, must be the determining factor then as to whether the resistance is actually born of genuine Christianity or not. Consider briefly what the Watchtower and Awake magazines have said about indoctrination, mass persuasion, and brainwashing, and about the means to counteract these. The June 15, 1956, issue of the Watchtower made these interesting and valid points, pages 358, 359. Note the admonition, prove to yourselves. If you can prove to yourself from the Bible the thoughts of God you have adopted, no brainwashing will sweep them from your mind. It is not enough to know what you believe, know why you believe it. An article in the New York Times Magazine, May 9, 1954, discussed communist brainwashing techniques and concluded, there is only one form of immunization against the totalitarian attack on human convictions. That one way was shown to be having deep convictions and thorough understanding of your belief. Otherwise, the article said, you will become an easy and willing victim, howling with the wolves in the woods. Deep conviction is here urged for the true Christian. That kind of conviction is not something attained on a group basis, it must be arrived at by the individual through personal thought, study, and conclusions. The inspired exhortation to prove to yourselves the will of God clearly calls for that kind of personal thought. Farther along this same article says, page 360. We usually believe what we want to believe, and one thing we like to believe is that we do our own thinking. Hence it is not too hard for clever propagandists to make us think their thoughts are ours. They plant the thought and nourish it, but do it so subtly that we think it is our own. 2 Corinthians, chapter 4 verse 4, the New World Translation. We may not be overreached by Satan, for we are not ignorant of his designs. We should know the clever tricks of his propagandists. They are many, but to mention just one, unsavory labels are stuck on anything that they oppose. But if he breezes airily by the better things, not being overly serious, he is a regular fellow. But to be pushed around by such social pressure, to be shoved and maneuvered by a fear of labels, is to show a pathetic immaturity, an inability to think for ourselves, a lack of intelligent convictions. To fail to do your own thinking, to be influenced by pressure and unsavory labels is to show pathetic immaturity, this material says. That the publishers of this information should be the same ones who would cause the expression independent thinker to become an unsavory label among its own members, may seem incredible, but that will be shown to be the case. In 1978, the August 22 issue of Awake carried an article titled Do Others Do Your Thinking, and it exposed the following methods of propagandists, pages 3, 4. Do others do your thinking? Propaganda has power. Does it overpower you? Or do you have a mind of your own? Education teaches you how to think. Propagandists tell you what to think. True educators present all sides of an issue and encourage discussion. Propagandists hammer hard on their view and discourage discussion. Many times their true motives are hidden. They sift the facts, tell the favorable ones and conceal the others. They distort and twist facts, specialize in lies and half-truths. Your emotions, not your logical thinking abilities, are their target. Many fall easy prey because it takes no effort to feel, whereas thinking is hard labor. And the propagandist sees to it that his message is made to seem wise, the right and moral one, and gives you a sense of importance and belonging if you follow it. You are one of the smart ones, you are not alone, you are comfortable and secure, so they say. Tyranny of authority, ridicule, name-calling, smears, slum, personal digs, all such tactics are marshaled to assail your mind and take it by storm. But even educated, sophisticated persons fall prey to a very unfair and untrue type of propaganda. This type assumes a superior air of dismissal of an opponent's viewpoint, treating it as rather pathetic and really not worth attention. It is what many evolutionists resort to in order to evade questions that they cannot answer. They can't prove their theory. So they resort to making assertions, and they scoff at all who dare to dispute them. They prove neither their assertions nor their smears, but by the tyranny of authority they pontificate their opinions, squelch objections, and intimidate opposers. It works, and supposedly intelligent people who know nothing about the theory believe it because all intelligent people believe it. The reader of this Awake article is urged not to be overpowered, even though information may seem to be wise, right, and moral, even though it gives you a sense of importance and belonging if you follow it. The material speaks forcefully in favor of open discussion, not letting the tyranny of authority keep you from testing everything as to its truthfulness. This is, it says, the course of wisdom. Somewhat later, an article asking has mass persuasion affected you, gave these points for protecting oneself against being herded into mass thinking. The person most easily brainwashed is the normal, average individual. Such a one is already conditioned to accept opinions of others rather than to form strong convictions of his own. On the other hand, those hardest to brainwash are ones with unconventional ideas and strong convictions and who are not afraid of what others think. The article continues, listing 5 ways to resist brainwashing. 1. Have strong convictions. As noted above, the person most easily brainwashed is the one quickly swayed by others. Do not go along with an idea just because your associates accept it. Make sure that the views you adopt are truthful. The best way to do that is by comparing them with the inspired Word of God, which is ultimately the truth. John, chapter 17 verse 17, 2 Timothy, chapter 3 verse 16. To find the reason, inadvertently we often accept attitudes without knowing what is behind them. For instance, people in your community may have a negative view of certain races or ethnic groups. But why? If you find the reason unconvincing, why adopt the viewpoint? 3. Resist improper thoughts. A dry sponge when immersed in liquid absorbs quite a lot. Even after it has been wrung out several times, some of the liquid remains. As for our minds, it is hard to avoid seeing, hearing or otherwise experiencing improper thoughts. But must we soak our minds full of them? Doing so will adversely affect our judgments and actions. How much better to resist improper thoughts and to dwell upon things that build up? Ephesians, chapter 5 verse 3-5. 4. Speak up for what you know to be right. This will give you opportunity to test what you believe and more firmly entrench the truth in your life. If you are convinced of the truth of a matter after thorough search, do not be disconcerted by ridicule from others. The Bible shows that Noah was convinced there was going to be a worldwide flood and he talked to others about it. 2 Peter, chapter 2 verse 5, indifference on the part of Noah's contemporaries did not change the facts. There was a global flood. Genesis, chapters 6-8, Matthew, chapter 24 verse 37-39. However, with regard to speaking up for what is right, it is important to keep in mind this scriptural guideline: he that is correcting the ridiculer is taking to himself dishonor, and he that is giving a reproof to someone wicked, a defect in him. Do not reprove a ridiculer, that he may not hate you. Give a reproof to a wise person and he will love you. Proverbs, chapter 9 verse 7, 8, no good purpose is served by debating or wrangling with someone bent on defending his personal opinion regardless of whether it is right or wrong. 5. Live the truth. Do not look for excuses to compromise what you know to be right. Remember, if something is right and proper, it will work out for your good. Do not be tricked into thinking that you are missing out on something or that you are unduly restricted because you conform to what is right. The footnote reads: Awake. January 8, 1980, pages 13, 14. End of footnote. All of these articles published by the Watchtower Society encourage, with Bible support, a personal determination as to the truthfulness, the scripturalness, of things taught, of what one believes. They do not advocate a go-along attitude simply to conform to the majority or the views of a particular group. They encourage personal testing, personal weighing, personal acceptance or rejection. They urge the reader to be willing to stand up for what he or she believes with the confidence that holding to the truth, without compromise, will always work out for the best. I agree wholeheartedly with all of these points. From my own experience as a witness, I have little doubt that the majority of Jehovah's Witnesses are willing to bear the unpleasantness of disapproval or disdain they may receive from people on the outside because of holding to beliefs that are unpopular. I think, in general, they are sincere in this nonconformist role toward those on the outside, and they are confident that, though unpopular, this is the right thing to do, the course God is pleased with. That has been true in my own case as well. There remains this question, however: can persons be consistent if they uphold these sound, solid principles set forth in these articles when dealing with sources of information and influence outside their particular religious community, and yet abandon these same principles within its boundaries? What, too, of an organization that urges its members to apply diligently such principles toward outside sources of information, but discourages, disparages, yes, even denounces those who apply them with regard to the information it itself supplies? Where this is the case, what reason is there for believing that the resistance to outside indoctrination, to mass persuasion, is necessarily and genuinely the product of deep convictions that come from thinking for oneself? What assurance is there that it is not the case of one indoctrination versus another indoctrination, that one's refusal to be swayed by unsavory labels and disapproval and peer pressure from the outside is not to some degree the result of being anxious to avoid unsavory labels and disapproval and peer pressure from within one's own religious community? More importantly, how meaningful is it if an organization urges people to reject subtle error, manipulation of facts and half-truths from other people, if at the same time it disallows this approach to its own teachings? Furthermore, how honest and consistent is this when it also attempts to impose a rule of silence on any who would use their God-given mental powers to discern such error, even to the point of labeling any discussion of it as rebellious talk? How consistent is it to praise independent thinking with regard to outside information, but to condemn it as a sign of immodesty and a lack of humility when it comes to information supplied within an organization? It would seem that Jesus' words about cleansing the inside of the cup so that the outside may also become clean, as also his warning against becoming like whitewashed graves that externally present one appearance but internally have another, give serious reason for concern in this regard. The footnote reads, Matthew, chapter 23 verse 25 to 28. End of footnote. A former witness in Brazil, who had served as a special pioneer and who after many years began to ask questions about certain of the organization's teachings, expressed his own experience this way: I cannot deny that I have been and am still influenced by the noble principles aimed at outsiders advocated in the organization's literature. I relied wholeheartedly on those principles and believed that any matter would be rightly considered by the organization. It is a painful blow to find out at the end that they are just part of a monologue, like other kinds of propaganda, that seeks no answer at all but only its own echo. The footnote reads, Augusto Oliveira, in a letter dated December 30, 1987. End of footnote. Applying the things said, by your words you will be acquitted, and by your words you will be condemned, Matthew, chapter 12 verse 37, New International Version. Certainly consistency would call for all of Jehovah's Witnesses to apply within the organization the previously quoted published exhortations to do your own thinking, do not let others do it for you. If you believe something, be sure you know why, and if you find the reason unconvincing, why adopt the viewpoint. Do not go along with an idea just because your associates accept it. Make sure that the views you adopt are truthful, soundly based and supported by Scripture. Do not be pushed into acceptance by pressure from others, by fear of what others think and fear of being labeled adversely, thereby demonstrating pathetic immaturity. Do not let the tyranny of authority either squelch objections or intimidate you from testing statements made by such authority. Do not fail to speak up on behalf of truth, nor seek excuses to compromise. Reasonably, this published exhortation is meant to be acted upon in a respectful, responsible, and Christian way. What would the result be if one of Jehovah's Witnesses today were to express his or her intention to do exactly what is stated above, within the organization, doing so in just such a respectful, responsible, and Christian manner? Every man on the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses, and I think virtually every elder in the more than 63,000 congregations earthwide, knows that this would almost certainly lead to that person's being viewed as dangerous, liable for disfellowshipment and ejection from the congregation. As has been amply documented, That is exactly what has happened and is happening to a growing number of persons who take those principles to heart. Contrast these published exhortations about the way to have genuine conviction with the reality of what exists among Jehovah's Witnesses. Reasonably, the more serious the issue and the more serious the possible consequences, the more important it would be to apply this counsel. As one example, the issue of alternative service had consequences that could mean imprisonment for a year or even years, being cut off from parents and family, perhaps a mate, loss of freedom to pursue whatever means of livelihood the person had, or to engage in any other pursuit that freedom normally allows. Consider, then, what branch committee members in many countries said on the matter of young male witnesses who risked imprisonment by rejecting government provisions for alternative service in place of military service. To recall a few of the statements, Belgium, few brothers are really in position to explain with the Bible why they refuse. Basically, they know it is wrong and that the society views it as such. Denmark, while many young brothers seem able to grasp arguments and think them out and explain them to a degree, it is felt that the majority of young brothers today follow the example of others and take the stand expected of them by the brotherhood without really understanding the basic principles and arguments involved, and without being able to explain their stand clearly. Hawaii, generally speaking, the brothers here have trouble seeing Bible principles governing the maintaining of strict neutrality. Once they know the society's stand on such issues, they fully cooperate, but do not see the principles too clearly upon which our stand rests. Norway, the brothers in Norway do not accept civilian work without a court sentence, mainly because they know that this is the society's policy and they are loyal to the society. It is difficult for them to understand why it is wrong to accept civilian work when the work itself is not wrong and condemned in the Bible. They cannot support their stand properly from the scriptures. Spain, when an elder discusses the matter of substitute service with someone, that person generally accepts that substitution amounts to equivalence. But this idea is not usually truly understood. Rather, it is taken to be the organization's viewpoint, and the elders present it as well as they can and the brothers loyally follow through as they know is expected of them. But it seems to us that many brothers find our reasoning somewhat artificial. Thailand, many have refused work out of a kind of group loyalty. They did not know the reason or principle why, but they heard a certain thing was wrong, so they refused. If the published statements in the Watchtower and Awake magazines have any validity at all, then, when compared with the statements of these branch committee members, they clearly identify these young witness men as either very vulnerable to brainwashing or as already victims of indoctrination and mass persuasion. In 1996, when the organization reversed its policy on alternative service, many hundreds, even thousands, of these young men were right then in prison, like thousands before them, but they really did not know why the position they took, which led to their imprisonment, should have been taken. They accepted a policy without seeing a sound basis for it. They allowed their decisions to be governed, not by solid evidence from God's word, but by group loyalty, and organizational loyalty. These are the same forces that give such potency to indoctrination on the part of what witnesses call worldly organizations. It is a case of doing what one's associates do and what the authority, the organization, says, even though one finds the reasons given to be insubstantial, even artificial. The view of alternative service these persons accepted was clearly a borrowed one, not their own. Concern over what others in their religious community would think, concern over reprisals by the organization in the form of excommunication, certainly must have weighed heavily in their thinking, causing them to shut out any questions from their minds and simply submit. These young witness men stood before government tribunals and declared themselves bound to an uncompromising position of rejecting alternative service unless first arrested and tried and sentenced to perform it by a judge, and they perhaps thought that such was their own conviction. But their inability to explain the reason for their stand shows that someone else has done their thinking for them. Recall the Watchtower statements earlier quoted. We usually believe what we want to believe, and one thing we like to believe is that we do our own thinking. Hence it is not too hard for clever propagandists to make us think their thoughts are ours. They plant the thought and nourish it, but do it so subtly that we think it is our own. I understand why those witness men felt as they did. Though the organizational policy today is considerably more technical and involved than it was back in the 1940s, I found myself in a very similar position, and expected to experience imprisonment. The footnote reads, "My draft board initially refused my request for classification as a minister, turned me down on appeal, sent use my order to report for induction into the armed services, and I would have been brought to trial and imprisonment had not appeals to state and federal authorities caused the local draft board to change its decision." End of footnote. I felt the same pressures from outside the organization and pressures from inside it. The pressures from inside it exerted greater force for me and made me determined, not only to refuse to engage in armed warfare, a decision that was genuinely the result of my own conviction, one I still hold, but also to reject any type of service or work as a conscientious objector, a decision that was not genuinely my own, that is, not the product of my own thinking and conclusions. I would think that all the members of the governing body had read the articles earlier quoted from and the truthful principles they set out as regards having genuine conviction. The footnote reads, "This might not be the case with all." In one governing body session, Milton Henschel mentioned that he found it difficult to keep up even with the Watchtower articles and rarely read the Awake magazine. That may well have been point 1e of others. End of footnote. Yet when the statements made by the branch committee members about the lack of understanding on the alternative service policy were brought to the governing body's attention, though a majority of the body favored changing the policy, I found it striking that there was an almost complete absence of dismay or even concern over the fact that men were willing to go to prison without really understanding why, that they were refusing to be in subjection to the superior authorities in this particular matter without being actually convinced that they had a scriptural basis for having taken a stand against such superior authorities. The footnote reads, Romans, chapter 13 verse 1-5. End of footnote. The evidence that group loyalty and essentially blind acceptance of organizational policy was taking the place of, perhaps in some cases even masquerading as, personal conscience did not seem to be a matter of great concern and never played any real role in the governing body discussion. One governing body member even quoted approvingly the words of the Danish branch coordinator, who said with regard to placing the matter of alternative service as something to be decided by individual conscience, "I shudder to think of putting these young men on their own choice." The footnote reads, statement quoted from a letter by Richard Abrahamson, later a member of the headquarters writing staff. End of footnote. This not only betrays an enormous lack of confidence in the young men among Jehovah's Witnesses, or of confidence in the organizations having done anything to bring them out of spiritual babyhood. It also says in effect that the organization should decide for them whether they should take a course involving possible, even probable, imprisonment without their having any true choice in the matter. If, as the Society's published articles professedly advocate, these young men had done their own thinking, had taken a stand based genuinely on personal conscience, the evidence from the branch committee members is that many, perhaps most, would have taken a course different from the policy established by the organization. Under the then prevailing arrangement that would have brought only one consequence, being declared disassociated from the congregation. Thus the organization apparently feels the men are not old enough, or mature enough, to make their own decisions, to think out their course and act according to their individual conscience before God as responsible Christians, but considers them old enough to spend part of their lives in prison without knowing why. Youthfulness is really not at issue, however. What is true of these young witnesses is true of most adult witnesses with regard to a host of other issues, employment, various factors relating to blood, their associations, advanced education, and similar matters. It should be remembered that the branch committee men who wrote the letters that revealed the facts just described are themselves adults, not young men. Yet they themselves were committed to following the organization's directives. They were willing to apply, or see applied, the prescribed sanction of excommunication toward any young men in their countries who might not conform to decreed policy. As a further illustration, consider this issue coming to the governing body from Germany. Typical of many such cases, it primarily relates to a witness woman whose non-witness husband was stationed with the occupation forces in Germany. The letter, photocopied and containing its various misspellings, but with names blocked out for privacy, shown on the following pages sets out the details. These German elders were admittedly confused by the organizational policy. On the one hand, it was allowable for a witness to teach a non-religious subject in a school owned by a religious organization, but not to teach the same subject in a school for children of army personnel, if the school was one funded or directed by the military. The following letter is found on page 402. Dear brothers, enclosed you find a letter you sent to Sister Blank. You also enclosed a copy of the Kingdom Service from September 1976 to give her more information about the matter in question. In the same Kingdom Service is mentioned a schoolteacher who might teach mathematics at a school owned by a religious organization. It seems that this is viewed as matter which is still within the gray area. After it was discussed in that time during our service meeting, some of our American sisters in Germany whose husbands are in the army, approached us and asked if they now also could work under certain circumstances as teachers in army schools or perform work in the Elmer, PX shops. We wanted to make sure and wrote a letter to the German branch and asked about this matter. The brothers of the German branch answer us on October 26, 1976 and told us that they would forward this question to Brooklyn. We waited for the answer till March 22, 1977. The brothers wrote us that the governing body in Brooklyn came to the conclusion that working for the European Exchange System, EES, or the post exchanges, does not fall into the gray area anymore because one would be also guilty of supporting wrong practices. Even selling food or clothes in these shops that serve personal purposes would be a direct connection with the army and therefore wrong for a Christian, especially as these shops are under the supervision of a general. So all these activities are not in the gray area anymore. I discussed this now through with Sister Blank, who wanted to make sure in this matter and wrote you with the comment to me, that whatever the brothers in Brooklyn decide she wanted to do. After I read the answer to her, I discussed your letter with other elders and our circuit overseer. We all came to the conclusion that it seems to contradict the letter we received from the governing body. Although you mentioned in your letter that she works for the Department of Defense, you wrote in the next paragraph that you don't know in what kind of work she really is involved. We ask now if that is of any importance, because she gets paid from the army as much as somebody who works at a PX shop selling food or cloth. If the later work is in the black area, so would be working as a teacher. These kind of situations were handled by the elders here in Germany quite well until the article in the Kingdom Service appeared about the brother working in a school owned by a religious organization. As we understood it, is this a matter of conscience and still within the gray area? From that time on we have to answer questions like, if a brother can work at a school owned by a religious organization, why can't we work at a school that is supervised by the army? We are teaching only mathematics, English etc., and don't break our neutrality. If the first case is in the gray area, why not the second? On a circuit assembly the question was raised by an elder, if a sister would not quit her job as a teacher at a school supervised by the Department of Defense, has she to be disfellowshipped? The clear answer from the district overseer was, yes. After your letter to Sister Blank, we are confused again and would appreciate if we could straighten this matter out. We are looking forward to your answer while going ahead keeping Jehovah's organization clean. We send you our warm Christian love and greetings. Your brothers. Since the Watchtower Society views all religious organizations, other than its own, as part of Babylon the great harlot of Revelation, and hence as opposers of God and Christ, it is difficult to see why such a different stand is taken as regards a school funded by the Defense Department as compared with one funded by a church organization. Yet for some indecipherable reason the one job is allowed, the other calls for disfellowshipping. Even if a witness does not understand, he or she must comply, and this is the mental attitude cultivated in the minds of all witnesses. Note that the witness involved is quoted as saying that whatever the brothers in Brooklyn decide she wanted to do. This is viewed as the right attitude, the theocratic attitude, one of loyalty to God's organization. Yet it is exactly contrary to the principles published in the Society's magazines previously quoted, with their admonitions against permitting authoritarian indoctrination and letting others do your thinking for you. When the elders here say that they will continue keeping Jehovah's organization clean, what does this really mean? It means that those men will continue to apply with all due vigor whatever policy may be current, and they will disfellowship anyone who does not adhere to that policy. For example, anyone engaging in work that was once classified as in a gray area but which, by organizational decree, has now been transferred to the black area. The elders may feel confused, as they themselves say, but they would not allow this to keep them from disfellowshipping the person and casting him or her out as unchristian. The main concern is to be obedient to society policy. The feeling is created that if the organization tells us to do it, we will not be held responsible by God if it is a mistake. That same mentality has prevailed among men of many lands and in many periods who have excused themselves of guilt in serious injustice by the claim that they were simply following orders from their superiors. Even the world's courts have rejected such an excuse. How much more should Christians reject it? The binding, restricting effect that this concern for organizational submission can have on persons' minds was illustrated to me by an experience related by Robert Lang, then the assistant Bethel home overseer at the international headquarters. He had been transferred to a different congregation in the New York City area, and he said that at one of the first meetings he attended there, the elders approached him for advice. It seems that a young woman, the sister of one of the ministerial servants, was disfellowshipped and was still attending meetings. She had a small baby and brought it with her to the Kingdom Hall in a baby carriage. The hall itself was on the second story of a building and the stairs were long and steep. The young woman would back up the stairs, pulling the baby carriage, with the baby in it, up the stairs as she went. The question the elders asked was whether it would be proper for the disfellowshipped woman's brother to assist her in getting up the stairs. Some thought so, others said, no, being disfellowshipped she should be considered as if she were not even there. To his credit, Lang said, I don't know what the rule is on this, I only know one thing, if I'm around when she starts pulling that carriage up the stairs, I'm going to help her. When I think of what could happen if she were to stumble and lose control of the carriage. The footnote reads, Robert Lang was for me one example of an individual's being the kind of person he was, not because of the organization, but in spite of the organization. End of footnote. The most frightening thing about this is that adult men did not feel they could be guided by their own hearts and minds in a circumstance so obviously calling for human kindness. The pressing concern for them was, not the danger to the infant's life, but what the organizational policy allowed in such cases. They gave evidence of having become emasculated men in matters of ethics, of right and wrong. This was not some rare instance. In Crisis of Conscience mention is made of articles I wrote in 1974 which greatly moderated the attitude toward those in a disfellowshipped state. The footnote reads, see Crisis of Conscience, page 37, 358. End of footnote. The assignment to write these articles resulted from cases involving disfellowshipped persons who wanted to attend meetings but who were without transportation to get to the meeting place. One was a young girl who had been disfellowshipped while yet in her teens. She had later moved into a country area. She applied for reinstatement, but the elders informed her that she needed to attend the meetings at the Kingdom Hall to qualify. There was no public transportation and she had no automobile. Her mother wrote to the headquarters, expressing concern for the danger of her young daughter walking country roads alone, and pleading that some dispensation be given so that the elders could help her. At the same time, another letter had been received from elders in a Midwestern congregation. It related the case of a woman who had been disfellowshipped and who was then in a drug rehabilitation center. She, too, wished to attend meetings but could only leave the center if someone signed her out, accepting responsibility for her and providing needed transportation. The elders said they had been doing this and were quick to add that when they signed her out they did not speak to her, that she simply got in the car, rode silently to the Kingdom Hall with them, sat in the back of the hall, and after the meetings went out to the car and rode back to the center. Why did they write their letter? Because they were deeply concerned that they might not be acting in accordance with existing organizational policy in what they were doing. At the governing body session, the decision was to allow such help, and, as stated, I was assigned to write articles setting forth the change in policy. The footnote reads, see the Watchtower, August 1, 1974, pages 460 to 473. End of footnote. The following Sunday after the session, I went to New Jersey to give a public talk. While there, one of the local elders approached me to ask a question. He related the situation of a disfellowshipped woman who lived some miles from the Kingdom Hall and who had requested help in getting to meetings. She said that her personal circumstances did not allow her to pay weekly taxi fares, and without help she would be forced to walk the considerable distance. He said that that very Sunday some of the sisters in the congregation had been traveling together in a car and had passed her on the road. He stated that when they got to the hall they were in tears because they felt obliged to pass her by without stopping. I was particularly happy to inform him that a decision had been made, by what was to him and all witnesses their Supreme Court, that such help was now allowable. Again, the tragic feature in all this is the way in which good and beautiful human emotions are stifled, chained, and paralyzed by organizational dominance and indoctrination. In reality, in the 1974 articles I went far beyond the matter of simply providing transportation or showing other acts of common courtesy to disfellowshipped persons, moderating the position in many other areas and particularly as regards family relationships. The articles were approved by the governing body before publishing. Indicative of the actual heart attitude of many, perhaps most witnesses, is that the articles were generally given appreciative reception, viewed as expressing more correctly the merciful attitude of God and Christ. As also stated in Crisis of Conscience, the year after my resignation from the governing body, the September 15, 1981 Watchtower returned to a policy regarding disfellowshipped persons much like the pre-1974 position. In some ways it is now even more rigid than it was then. Some elders and traveling overseers, regrettably, expressed satisfaction at what they saw as a tightening up of organizational policy. And, as we have seen in Chapter 11, today men and women are allowing their treatment of other humans to be governed strictly by that policy. In so doing they are allowing their consciences to be overridden by men, their compassion to be turned on or shut off at will by organizational decree. Were the organization to change its policy tomorrow, the majority would change with it. This is indoctrination in one of its worst forms. What is true regarding the acceptance of organizational policies is equally true of organizational doctrine and interpretation of Scripture. It is the almost unquestioning acceptance of these that in fact precedes and underlies the related acceptance of policies. It is equally true that the vast majority of witnesses, elders included, if given only the Bible itself, would have serious difficulty in presenting evidence in support of a considerable portion of those teachings. Yet elders are willing to take disfellowshipping action against any congregational member who seriously questions or expresses conscientious disagreement with any of such teachings. What causes people to let an organization supplant their conscience with its own viewpoint, or at least to superimpose its collective conscience on their own? What moves elders to disfellowship people when the elders themselves may not be fully convinced in their own minds and hearts that the organization's position is necessarily the right one, genuinely scriptural? The footnote reads, one might also ask how different the attitude created is from that prevailing during the Nazi regime in Germany, when many individuals excused their acts as simply obedience to a higher authority, thus disclaiming personal responsibility. End of footnote. I have asked myself those questions as to my own past course as a witness. Although the only disfellowshipping cases in which I had any personal involvement as a member of a judicial committee related to acts of clear immorality, I know that for most of my life as a witness I consistently sought to uphold and explain all policies and teachings advanced. I view myself as having average intelligence, and yet for decades I was wholly devoted to supporting the full scope of whatever the organization published, and I could say, like the Apostle Paul, that I was making greater progress in my religion than many of my own age and was more zealous than they for the traditional views of the organization. The footnote reads, Galatians, chapter 1 verse 14. End of footnote. How did it come about? And how does it come about with millions of other persons? There are a number of factors. Consider an example. Methods employed. This particular man had been very depressed and he was attracted to the religion for a number of reasons. Of the first meeting he attended, he relates, I enjoyed the stimulating conversation and energetic atmosphere at the meeting. These people related to each other as easily as brothers and sisters and clearly felt they were part of one global family. They seemed very happy with their lives. After my depression of the previous month, I was invigorated by all that positive energy. I went home that night feeling lucky to have met such nice people. I was elated at the thought that my life's path was now on the only true track, the thought that God was actively working to bring about the Garden of Eden. No more war, no more poverty, no more ecological destruction. Just love, truth, beauty, and goodness. We truly identified with the early Christians. The more people opposed us, the more committed we felt. It was as if we were God's army in the middle of a spiritual war, the only ones who could go to the front lines and fight Satan each day. Very early he was encouraged to share with others what he had learned. Of those who responded to his witness, he says, we saw believers as people searching for God, or looking for spiritual meaning in their lives. It was always amazing to me to realize how many people in this category told us they had just been praying to God to show them what He wanted them to do with their lives. Many believed they were spiritually led to meet one of our members. These words could easily be found on the lips of many of Jehovah's Witnesses. They could as easily be found in an experience published in the Watchtower or Awake magazines. Yet they are not the words of one of Jehovah's Witnesses. They are the words of Steve Hassan, a former member of the Unification Church headed by Korean leader Reverend Moon, a movement often referred to as the Moonas. The toot note reads, quotations are from Stu Hassan's book Combating Cult Mind Control, Park Street Press, 1988, first edition, pages 13, 19, 24, 42. End of footnote. In his 2.5 years of association he became an ardent advocate and trusted leader of that movement, completely loyal and dedicated to its mission. He resisted any effort by family members or others to take him away from what he was convinced was the truth. After an accident opened the way for a complete change of viewpoint, he determined to provide others with the benefit of his insight into the means by which humans can be led to give over their minds and consciences to a religious system. The book he subsequently wrote did not discuss Jehovah's Witnesses. Admittedly, it dealt principally with movements that resort to obvious and extreme methods of indoctrination, including physical isolation, rituals and chants, and similar practices. Yet there are certain elements he describes as basic in mind control which surely merit serious thought. Consider the following: those who become candidates for mind control, as found in such groups as the Moonas, are not, in the majority, strange people. Of the thousands of persons he spoke with or counseled, Hassan stated, the great majority were stable, intelligent, idealistic people. The sheer number of sincere, committed members whom a newcomer meets are probably far more attractive to a prospective convert than any doctrine or structure. The footnote reads, Combating Cult Mind Control, first edition, pages 42, 76. End of footnote. Why, then, did they allow others to dominate their thinking? The essence of mind control is that it encourages dependence and conformity, and discourages autonomy and individuality. It seeks to undermine an individual's integrity in making his own decisions. The footnote reads, Ibid, page 55. An article in Awake, August 8, 1965, page 18, similarly said, contrary to common belief, it is the normal, average person that is the most easily indoctrinated. Such a person is normal because he has been influenced to such an extent by the community that he conforms to all its social standards and behaves only in an acceptable way. His held opinions are often borrowed and usually do not come from independent, intellectual thinking. The article claims that Jehovah's Witnesses are different in these areas. Yet in most cases they exemplify the very kind of person described. End of footnote. Watchtower training causes Jehovah's Witnesses to view independent thinking as sinful, an indication of disloyalty to God and his appointed channel. Pointing to a further element of mind control, that of control of information, on the basis of his experience with the Munas, Hassan states, "The ideology is internalized as the truth, the only map of reality. All that is good is embodied in the group. All that is bad is on the outside. There is never a legitimate reason for leaving. Members are told that the only reasons why people leave are weakness, temptation, insanity, brainwashing, pride, sin, and so on." The footnote reads, Combating Cult Mind Control, pages 61, 62, 84. End of footnote. I do not favor the loose application of the word cult that has become common today. As someone observed, for many the term is a label they attach to any religion they do not like. I do believe that a religion that is not a cult may nonetheless manifest many cult-like qualities. Of the elements presented above as fundamental features of religions exercising mind control, it is a fact that every single one of them is clearly present among Jehovah's Witnesses. In the case of Jehovah's Witnesses there is no physical isolation like that employed by some religious movements, as is also done by officials who take persons as political prisoners for indoctrination. Yet there is isolation of a very definite kind. The footnote reads, as regards brainwashing, I also question the correctness of applying the term to the witnesses. See the essay on this subject on the Commentary Press website, www.commentarypress.com, end of footnote. The organization takes the biblical exhortation not to be part of the world and applies this as meaning that Jehovah's Witnesses should restrict to the minimum their association with anyone not of their faith, which, in the final analysis, means anyone not embracing the current teachings of the organization. The footnote reads, John, chapter 17 verse 14 to 16. End of footnote. Such persons are not in the truth, which is the same as saying that they are all in the lie. All non-witnesses, no matter how fine their personal qualities, no matter how high their standards, no matter how deep their faith in God, Christ, and the Bible may be, are worldly. Social contact is acceptable if it is done with a view to creating an opportunity to witness to the worldly persons, it is discouraged on any other basis. A witness may, in conversation with a worldly neighbor or fellow employee or business associate, steer discussion into religious topics, but, as I know from experience, the thought is always how to give the person a witness. There is concern that the direction of the conversation will be one way and one way only. It is not to see if the witness might learn something from the other person or to have any genuine interchange of thoughts and ideas. After all, that would be useless since the other person is not in the truth. When the person conversed with proves not inclined to agree with the witness presented, whether a teaching such as the significance of 1914 or any other topic, the witness generally feels that the conversation is unproductive and may as well stop. A mental barrier is raised toward any remarks heard that do not conform to the current teachings of the organization. Evidence that might disprove any of those teachings usually causes the witness to respond in a programmed way, to quickly shut the door of his mind to that evidence. Similarly with reading material. While the Watchtower Society's publications quote frequently, at times liberally, from all sorts of worldly publications, including sociological, psychological and religious works, the feeling is generated that only the organization can safely do this, and that, particularly as regards religious publications, including Bible commentaries, it is dangerous for the average witness to read such sources of information. Not merely caution, but distrust and aversion are engendered. Evidently the faith developed by the organization is not viewed as sufficiently robust to resist the effects of such reading. Again, in this area one finds two separate messages offered in the Watchtower publications, one directed to those outside the organization, the opposite toward those within it. Those outside are urged to question their religious beliefs, no matter how long they have held them. Articles titled "An Open or a Closed Mind, Which Do You Have?" and "An Open Mind Wins God's Approval" appear in the November 22, 1984, Awake. And another titled "Are You Open to New Ideas?" in the January 15, 1989 Watchtower. These are all directed entirely to non-witnesses. The first article, on page 3, gives a definition of prejudice as a judgment or opinion, favorable or unfavorable, formed beforehand or without due examination, a mental decision based on other grounds than reason or justice, especially, a premature or adversely biased opinion. Recognizing that decisions made without due examination or judgments reached on other grounds than reason or justice are evidences of a closed mind, the article advocates an open mind which is receptive to new information and ideas, and willing to examine and evaluate information without a biased attitude. Farther along it states, a closed mind may indicate lack of knowledge. We may know so little about a subject, or have information so distorted or incomplete, that the facts necessary to reach proper conclusions are missing. A closed mind may betray a lack of interest in the subject or a reluctance to look into the matter. In fact, it could even be a sign of uncertainty or doubt. For example, if we are unable to defend our religious views, we may find ourselves lashing out against those who challenge our beliefs, not with logical arguments, but with slurs and innuendos. This smacks of prejudice and of a closed mind. What makes a religion right is its total adherence to God's word. Whether our religion meets this criterion or not can only be determined by open-mindedly comparing it with the Bible. It seems incredible that the organization's writers cannot see the obvious inconsistency between these exhortations to open-mindedness given to outsiders and the exactly opposite admonition given to those within the organization. A question from readers in the May 1, 1984, Watchtower, page 31, argues that it is right that Jehovah's Witnesses, going to people's doors offering them Watchtower literature, should refuse to accept religious literature the householders visited may in turn offer them. Among other things it states, witnesses do not go to people's doors searching for truth or enlightenment. Rather, they already have devoted countless hours learning the truth from God's word. Jehovah's Witnesses are not ignorant of others' beliefs. They have gained considerable basic knowledge of the doctrinal beliefs of religions common in their area. So it would be foolhardy, as well as a waste of valuable time, for Jehovah's Witnesses to accept and expose themselves to false religious literature that is designed to deceive. As loyal Christians, let us hold to God's standards, feeding our minds on what is true and righteous, and holding appreciatively and loyally to the channel from which we first learned Bible truth. The open-mindedness hoped for from non-witness readers, causing them to examine literature that offers views contrary to their religious beliefs, is paradoxically discouraged among witnesses. Watchtower and Awake. Articles disparage closed-mindedness and a seclusionist attitude, yet that attitude is nowhere more evident than among Jehovah's Witnesses themselves. Witnesses may say they are informed about other religions and their beliefs. But for the vast majority, the information they have is only what their own religious organization has seen fit to give them. It is pre-packaged, carefully edited information, generally with the conclusions already spelled out for them. On page 412, the comments on the foot of the picture say, persons of the public are urged to keep an open mind toward Watchtower literature even though it changes their present religious beliefs. On the other hand, witnesses are urged to immediately destroy literature that is critical of their beliefs. Note on the picture presented on page 412, the mailman just leaving, indicating that the woman has not even examined what she received. The writer of the article seems not to realize that, if the persons at whose homes witnesses call to offer their literature are members of a religion in which they believe firmly and from which they have received whatever Bible knowledge they possess, those householders could use the identical argument in refusing Watchtower literature, rejecting it as literature that is false and designed to deceive, something that it would be a waste of valuable time to read. The footnote reads, "The Awake Magazine article on having an open mind carries an illustration of a man expressing, by face and hand, determined rejection. The picture could be that of a Catholic or Protestant rejecting literature of Jehovah's Witnesses that differs with his beliefs. It could just as well be one of Jehovah's Witnesses adamantly rejecting literature that differs with his beliefs." End of footnote. They, too, may have read church publications about Jehovah's Witnesses and therefore say they are not ignorant of their beliefs. They would, of course, then be viewed by witnesses as close-minded, prejudiced. Surely the words of Jesus are applicable here, when he says, "Why do you observe the splinter in your brother's eye and never notice the plank in your own? How dare you say to your brother, 'Let me take the splinter out of your eye,' when all the time there is a plank in your own? Hypocrite! Take the plank out of your own eye first, and then you will see clearly enough to take the splinter out of your brother's eye." The footnote reads, Matthew, chapter 7 verse 3-5, the Jerusalem Bible. End of footnote. The September 8, 1987, Awake magazine contains articles directed primarily toward those of the Lutheran faith. One article is built around quotations from sermons of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a Protestant theologian executed by the Nazis. Presumably, if a witness at the door of a German householder were offered a pamphlet containing Bonhoeffer's sermons, he or she would be expected to reject this out of loyalty as something that it would be foolhardy and a waste of valuable time to read. In his or her Awake magazine, however, the sermon quotations from this Protestant pastor, according to Watchtower definition, a member of Babylon the Great, now become acceptable, sanctified for reading by loyal witnesses. The article makes several valid points as to the deprecating view of the Bible held by some Protestant theologians and other facets where many church members show themselves remiss. Consider, however, these points made on pages 8, 10, and 11, the words in italics are those the Awake writer is quoting from Bonhoeffer's sermons. Note the following excerpts from some of his sermons. Ask yourself, what would heeding his words mean for the Lutheran Church? For my church? In religion only one thing is of essential importance, that it be true. This agrees with what Jesus said, God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. John, chapter 4 verse 24, see also John, chapter 8 verse 32, chapter 14 verse 6, chapter 16 verse 13. Are you sure that everything your church teaches is really true? If your church fails to act, will you? If, after making an honest investigation, you are less than pleased with what you see, do more than just complain. A journalist, while commenting on Karl Barth's statement that a church is its members, logically concluded, church members are responsible for what the church says and does. So ask yourself, am I willing to share responsibility for everything my church says and does? You may sincerely believe that your church is no part of false religion that God says he will soon destroy. But your life depends upon being 100% sure. Are you? For those of other religions, absolute truth is net as the criterion, everything should be really true. They should be 100% sure about their religion. And if they are less than pleased with what they see, they should do more than just complain, because they share responsibility for everything their church says and does. On the basis of all that has been presented thus far from Watchtower publications about loyalty and submission to the theocratic organization, just imagine what would happen if any witness were to follow this exhortation in his religion. Instead, he must realize that these powerful words apply only to them, not to us. Many of the criticisms the Awake article presents regarding Lutheranism have validity. But those wrongs do not make witness positions right, their errors do not cancel out Watchtower errors or make them less reprehensible. Notably, the Awake writer can quote Protestant sources, including Lutherans, who level such criticisms themselves. These persons can do no without being excommunicated from their churches. One of Jehovah's Witnesses could not do the same. When he sees clear evidence of error, of unscriptural policies, in his religion, he should not complain, and certainly not leave, as is implied that Lutherans should do regarding their religion. Instead, he should quietly wait for Jehovah to straighten it out in his due time. What is right and needful on the part of Lutherans is at the same time wrong and unnecessary on the part of witnesses. And the remarkable thing is that most witnesses, including the writer of the Awake article, see no double standard in all this, see nothing amiss in giving an exhortation to others that they cannot apply to themselves. The earlier quoted question from readers assures Watchtower readers that their refusal to read or even accept literature householders offer them is not being narrow-minded, that, far from this, it is out of wisdom and respect for God's counsel that they take this course. But the reasoning never comes to grips with the real issue. While referring to Paul and his course in boldly speaking the truth, it never demonstrates that he refused to discuss opposing views or defend himself against criticism. To the contrary, Paul was willing to be all things to all men. The footnote reads, 1 Corinthians, chapter 9 verse 19 to 23. End of footnote. Instead, the Watchtower relies on bias and prejudgment and the use of unsavory labels, false religious literature which is designed to deceive, poisonous writings distributed for the sake of dishonest gain, buying which would be to finance wickedness, to give force to its claims. But by this article loyal witnesses have been told that they are not being narrow-minded when they urge others to look critically at their religion while refusing to do the same themselves, and they accept. God's channel has spoken and that is enough. The sum of the evidence is, then, that although no extreme physical isolation occurs, a very effective mental isolation is produced by the organization's interpretation placed on Jesus' words about not being part of the world. The community of believers becomes quite insulated and intellectually sealed off from any source of scriptural material other than that coming from the one voice, that of the organization. They are continually told that this is the only way to keep them from being misled. The apparent aim is to create a sterile atmosphere in which the views and interpretations of the organization can circulate freely without having to confront any challenge. As a rule, the longer one is associated with the organization, the more concentrated his or her social contacts are, the more restricted friendships are to those within the organization. Even worldly relatives, meaning non-witness relatives, are often gradually shunted off to a rather cool and distant relationship. One's thus becoming part of an exclusive community with only limited, necessary contact with anyone outside is the factor that gives such enormous power to any disfellowshipping decree established by the organization. One's whole social life resides within the organization. If associated for many years, to be disfellowshipped means to be cut off from virtually every friendship one has. Particularly for those in their elderly years of life, this can present a devastatingly depressing prospect. The situation parallels closely that of persons in apostolic times who were cast out of the synagogue, since the synagogue was the center of all social contact in a Jewish community. The footnote reads, compare John, chapter 12 verse 42. End of footnote. I strongly doubt that most persons, in reading the Bible itself, would ever be led to view Jesus' words about not being part of the world in the extreme way conveyed by the Watchtower publications. Not that such an exclusivistic view is not found in the Bible. It is. But it is the viewpoint taken by the Pharisees, not that taught by Jesus Christ or his apostles. As already seen, the very name Pharisee means separated or exclusive. In their extreme views, this religious group sought to be separate from, and exclude from their association, all persons not holding to their particular traditional teachings and standards of holiness, viewing all such as unclean. The footnote reads, Matthew, chapter 15 verse 1-9, John, chapter 9 verse 16, see also Pharisees in the Watchtower publication Insight on the Scriptures. End of footnote. Jesus Christ set a very different example from such extremists, and this incensed them, caused them to condemn him and the way he associated with others. In reading his words, not only in the Sermon on the Mount but in all his teachings, one finds that Jesus' primary focus was not on an elaborate set of doctrinal interpretations but on the real goal set out in the scriptures, their true aim and thrust, namely love of God and love of neighbor. His words emphasize conduct and deeds that manifest this love, and his apostles urged the same in all their letters. When they deal with the need to be discriminatory as to association, it is with regard to essentials, not minor points of difference, and definitely not because of extra-biblical policies, rulings, reasonings, and interpretations, the product of sectarian thinking. In his letter to the Galatians, the Apostle Paul does bring in the matter of teachings, saying, "I am astonished at the promptness with which you have turned away from the one who called you and have decided to follow a different version of the good news. Not that there can be more than one good news, it is merely that some troublemakers among you want to change the good news of Christ, and let me warn you that if anyone preaches a version of the good news different from the one we have already preached to you, whether it be ourselves or an angel from heaven, he is to be condemned. I am only repeating what we have told you before. If anyone preaches a version of the good news different from the one you have already heard, he is to be condemned." The footnote reads, Galatians, chapter 1 verse 6-9, the Jerusalem Bible. End of footnote. Incredible as it may seem, those words are today applied by the Watchtower Society to any who fail to agree and who express their disagreement, not with the first-century apostolic message that Paul preached, but with its own current teachings. Thus, after having earlier quoted these very words of Paul in a question from readers' reply, the April 1, 1986, Watchtower goes on to say, page 31. Approved association with Jehovah's Witnesses requires accepting the entire range of the true teachings of the Bible, including those scriptural beliefs that are unique to Jehovah's Witnesses. The article argues that those who do not are rightfully excommunicated. This means forcing Paul's words out of context, actually turning them around to mean exactly the opposite of what they say. For Paul shows that there is only one good news, and that is the good news as preached in the first century, not something appearing for the first time in some 20th century publication or magazine. It is the good news that any person can find in any Bible without being dependent on some modern-day publication to convey it to him, not something that is incomprehensible without such a publication. It is not some special message of post-apostolic development which has the effect of making the Bible alone insufficient, as implied by the Watchtower president's morning remarks to the headquarters family, quoted earlier. The footnote reads, see chapter 2, pages 32, 33. End of footnote. According to the apostle, there is one and only one message to deliver, the one already preached by him and others at that time and recorded by inspired Bible writers, and no one, angel or man, has the right to bring in some other message than that already given, which Paul calls the good news about the Christ. The footnote reads, 2 Corinthians, chapter 2 verse 12, 4 verse 4, 9 verse 13. End of footnote. It is the everlasting good news, the faith that was once for all time delivered to the holy ones, and it therefore needs no adjusting, no modernizing or updating by uninspired men in our time. The footnote reads, Revelation, chapter 14 verse 6, Jude, verse 3. End of footnote. The first stage is thinking back over my 43 years of active association. I have no doubt that the almost unquestioning submission found among Jehovah's Witnesses develops gradually. I have no hesitation in saying that I gained considerable knowledge of the scriptures from my active association with the Witness organization, far more than I had previously. The footnote reads, this is true even though I was born of parents who were already witnesses. End of footnote. At the same time, I eventually came to realize that the organization itself brought people along only to a certain point. It brought them, at times, from biblical illiteracy to what might be called a second or third grade level. They learned how to locate specific texts in the Bible, received some knowledge of biblical history, and read for themselves certain fundamental teachings directly in the scriptures, and for many this was not only helpful but very impressive. If there is any one thing I am grateful for as regards my 40 years of full-time service as a witness, it is that at least I did turn the attention of some persons to the Bible who previously knew little or nothing about it. In this particular aspect the work of Jehovah's Witnesses merits commendation, and the failure of many religious denominations to build up interest in the Bible merits concern. In directing people to God's Word as found in the Scriptures, Jehovah's Witnesses perform a helpful service. If only that initial direction were held to and built upon in what follows, but there is where the problem rests. After this initial raising of their level of knowledge, the vast majority of persons enter onto a plateau. The longer they associate, the more organizational teachings take preeminence over actual study and meditation on the Scriptures themselves. As a result, many, perhaps most witnesses, after 20, 30 or 40 years of association know relatively little more about the Bible than they did after their first year or so of association. They are left as children, with great dependence on the mother organization, and a feeling of insecurity without its direction of their thinking and lives. Their spiritual growth stagnates, unless they themselves go beyond the society's program and by personal effort gain greater knowledge and understanding of Scripture. As a result of letting the organization act as their conscience for them, their spiritual strength is in some respects less in later life than it was in their early period of association. They may endure hardships, even sacrifice, to be loyal to the organization, and thus may give the appearance of spiritual fortitude. But they do not have the strength to make genuinely personal decisions of conscience and accept the consequences of those decisions. Initially I was attracted by the appeal to reasoning made by many Watchtower publications. Since these publications were often designed to encourage people of other religions to re-examine and re-evaluate, even to question, the validity of their religion's teachings, it was imperative that these publications stress the need to think for oneself, to do independent thinking. People in the beginning are regularly encouraged not to believe teachings without first testing them thoroughly according to Scripture. But the testing is restricted almost entirely to the individual's previously held beliefs, and only certain of these are targeted for testing. Such teachings as the inherent immortality of the human soul, the belief in a hell of literal fire and physical torment or similar points are the focus of much of the testing. The argumentation is generally quite well developed on these points. Because of this, the person is often sufficiently impressed that, as other presentations of teachings follow, he or she inclines to accept these more or less on trust, without requiring the same evidence. Remarkably, most witnesses are so impressed by these initially targeted teachings about the soul's mortality, hell's being synonymous with the grave or the death state, and similar points that they think and speak of them as the basic doctrines of the Scriptures, teachings forming the principal criteria for identifying the one, true religion. Yet one cannot find in the Bible even one chapter devoted to a discussion of such subjects. It is not that people in Bible times did not have beliefs about the immortality of the soul, or a place of torment for the wicked. Most races and religions did. But the Bible writers were not inspired to make discussion or refutation of these the prominent, fundamental subjects of their writings. The texts and statements that do relate to them are only incidental to the discussion of other topics. The average witness, then, may feel quite well equipped to discuss the soul or hellfire, but feel quite lost if asked to discuss, for example, Paul's letter to the Romans and its forceful arguments regarding salvation by faith, not by works. Aside from a certain set of proof texts used in support of principal witness teachings, the majority of members would find great difficulty in discussing intelligently most of the apostolic letters. Catechistical approach. While personal study is often encouraged, that study is carefully programmed. Witnesses are expected to read specific Watchtower publications in preparation for the 5 weekly meetings. Although one of these meetings includes a reading of one or more chapters of the Bible, this represents only a minor portion of the total assigned material. The footnote reads, as perhaps at least some indication of the degree of the relative importance given to the Bible itself, if there are young children enrolled in the theocratic school, often their assignment is to do this Bible reading. End of footnote. Focus is on the organization's own publications rather than the Scriptures themselves. The meetings where the assigned material is discussed are themselves also thoroughly programmed, with no open discussion provided for. They are largely question and answer sessions, with the questions already prepared by the organization and the answers set forth in the assigned publication. This is a catechistical approach which does not encourage genuine mental effort or frank discussion but merely the repeating, even if in one's own words, of the thinking of the headquarters organization. Actually, in almost every meeting I have attended, a large percentage of those participating read their response to the question word for word directly from the assigned publication. Aside from this rigid programming, another reason there is seldom any raising of serious questions is, as the Watchtower and Awake articles quoted point out, that most people find thinking is hard labor. The footnote reads, Awake, August 22, 1978, page 3. End of footnote. Most are willing for others to do their thinking for them, though, as again those articles observe, they like to believe that they are doing their own thinking and to believe that what they adopt as truth has come through their use of their mental powers. The footnote reads, The Watchtower, June 15, 1956, page 360. End of footnote. The information contained in the Society's publications is presented with great positiveness and few feel inclined to question its rightness or put forth the mental effort to test its arguments. So, while questions are permissible, the questioner is always expected to accept whatever answer is provided from the organization's publications. The individual should allow himself to be readjusted by what the publication says. For one to state that the publication's answer is frankly not satisfying, that the argument does not appear to be sound, that human reasoning and interpretation seem to be superimposed on Scripture, is to lay oneself open to possible labeling as self-willed, lacking in humility, presumptuous. Doubts are deemed a lack of faith, evidence of spiritual weakness, a prideful spirit, a leaning toward apostasy. True, there is periodic acknowledgement in the publications that the writers are, after all, imperfect men, and that the organization has never claimed to be infallible. In actual practice it works out quite differently. One finds out that this only applies to the past, not to the present. While the organization must recognize that it has changed a considerable number of its past teachings, which makes it evident that they were in error, it does not feel moved to modesty by those errors, so as to remind its readers that what it now says may also suffer due to that same imperfection. To the contrary, Jehovah's Witnesses are called on to take whatever is currently taught as if it were infallible. In effect they are told, you should accept everything published as absolute truth until such time as we may tell you it isn't. This is, purely and simply, mind control. In all this, the Watchtower organization is not engaging in something new or distinctive. It is simply following a pattern, one common in the past and in the present. Intellectual intimidation to achieve the surrender of one's thought processes. Congregation members are constantly presented with the organization's claims of divine backing and authority, of the faithful and discreet slave. As but one example, the June 15, 1964, Watchtower on page 365 stated, as Jehovah revealed his truths by means of the first-century Christian congregation, so he does today by means of the present-day Christian congregation. Through this agency he is having carried out prophesying on an intensified and unparalleled scale. All this activity is not an accident. Jehovah is the one behind all of it. We understand that God revealed his truths at the time of the first-century congregation by divine inspiration, by divine communication and direction to the apostles and others, with the result of inspired speech and writings that are as true today as they were 1900 years ago. To say that so he does today by means of the present-day Christian congregation is, for all practical purposes, to claim divine inspiration. Jehovah is made responsible for all of it, and what servant of God would want to resist him? As former traveling overseer Ron Fry observed, the society doesn't claim to be inspired, but it speaks with the same degree of authority as though it was and is, and they demand that they be taken at face value as though they are inspired, not even permitting people to question, or to have doubts or reservations about anything they teach. Then they beg off from responsibility when something has to be changed or corrected or some prophecy goes unfulfilled. In place of inspired information, the publications regularly speak of the organization as uniquely possessing revealed truth. On this, Fry comments, the use of the term revealed as opposed to claiming inspiration is merely a matter of semantics, a distinction that represents no difference, and is only called upon to explain away changes, contradictions, and disappointments. If you take the view that they are merely a group of religious men, sincere but not especially guided divinely, then their experiences make sense, because it illustrates the human factor, miscalculations, and cultishness and so on. But, on the other hand, to argue that Jehovah is behind all of this, then it doesn't make sense. The concept of revealed truth is employed repeatedly. If it is revealed, who revealed it? The claim is that God did. How then can it be anything other than inspired, infallible? The contrast, however, between the revelation of truth to the apostles and others in the first century as compared with the history of shifting, fluctuating teachings of the Watchtower organization in modern times, is enormous. The office of divine prophet, by somewhat similar shading of expressions, the organization states that it does not make original prophecies, that it merely proclaims those already found in Scripture. The footnote reads, the original Greek term for prophesy does have the basic sense of simply to proclaim or tell forth and may or may not include prediction. End of footnote. This, of course, is not in full harmony with the facts, since in the past it has published predictions centered on certain dates nowhere mentioned in Scripture. Nonetheless, this presentation enables it to claim prophetic office while at the same time exempting itself from the responsibility and accountability that rightly accompany that office. After quoting God's words to the rebellious people of Ezekiel's time that they would certainly know also that a prophet himself happened to be in the midst of them, the book The Nations Shall Know That I Am Jehovah, written by Franz and published in 1971, makes these points, page 70. Likewise, it was a trying mission upon which the modern Ezekiel class was sent, to religious people of the same type as those in Ezekiel's day. But regardless of how Christendom views or regards this group of anointed witnesses of Jehovah, the time must come, and that shortly, when those making up Christendom will know that really a prophet of Jehovah was among them. Later, on page 292, the book takes the matter much farther, saying, none of us should want to be like these indecisive, unresponsive ones. Better it is to know now, rather than too late, that there is an authentic prophetic class of Christians among us, and to accept and act upon the Bible message, not as the word of men, but, just as it truthfully is, as the word of God. 1 Thessalonians, chapter 2 verse 13, those who wait undecided until what Jehovah's Christian witnesses have been proclaiming comes true will also have to know that a prophet himself had proved to be in the midst of them. Ezekiel, chapter 33 verse 33, but such belated knowledge will not mean salvation for them, for it will find their hearts and their ways to be unchanged. What is to be gained by hesitating and doubting to the end that Jehovah can raise up and has raised up a genuine prophet within our generation? Certainly it will gain for no one the divine favor and protection needed during the speedily approaching Great Tribulation upon Christendom and the rest of Babylon the Great. Thus, the faithful and discreet slave class is called the Ezekiel class, as also the Jeremiah class, the Elijah class, used as applying to them for the period before and up to Judge Rutherford's death in 1942, and the Elisha class, considered as applying from and after that event. The footnote reads, see the book Let Your Name Be Sanctified, pages 334 to 337. The book Revelation, its grand climax at hand, page 166, speaks in similar vein of the fiery judgment messages proclaimed by Watchtower representatives in the 1914 to 1918 period as being foreshadowed by the prophetic work of Moses and Elijah. Despite this, those fiery judgment messages are today not deemed sufficiently important by the organization to maintain them even in print. End of footnote. The book says that Jehovah has raised up a genuine prophet within our generation. What servant of God would not feel compelled to heed the words of such a genuine prophet of God? In fact, the quoted material warns of dire results to any who hesitate and have doubts and therefore fail to accept what this prophet says. Frequently quoted is the text at Amos, chapter 3 verse 7, which reads, "The sovereign Lord Jehovah will not do a thing unless he has revealed his confidential matter to his servants the prophets." What is there said of the prophets is arbitrarily transferred over to modern times, and witnesses are told that the scripture's prophetic meaning is made known to us through the faithful and discreet slave, that group of anointed Christians whom the Master, Jesus, is using now, and that Jehovah provides his loyal servants with advance knowledge about this system's end. The footnote reads, The Watchtower, July 1, 1984, pages 8, 9. End of footnote. Examples of this advance knowledge may be found in various Watchtower articles of the 1970s and 1980s, see footnote. The footnote reads, see The Watchtower, July 1, 1984, pages 9 to 12, October 15, 1980, pages 17 to 23, January 15, 1977, pages 40 to 44. End of footnote. These utilize news reports current at the time as evidence that events leading to Babylon the Great's destruction already are underway. Yes, right now in 1980, events are taking place that are preparing the way for that execution, with militarized political powers, radical elements of the U.N., pointed to as the imminent destroyers, and that the rumblings of that approaching confrontation are to be heard often in the news of the day. In support, quotations were made as to communist hostility toward religion. This was a persistent, obvious sign. The dropping of the waters of the river Euphrates that preceded ancient Babylon's destruction was said to be having a modern fulfillment through a dropping of people's support for the world's religions and particularly Christendom. The overall trend was stated to be unmistakable and, again, news items of the day were presented as the writing on the wall evidencing that this impending destruction would occur very soon. Now, in the 2000s, the world picture has altered dramatically. Communist animosity to religion has dissipated, with the demise of, not world religion, but of communism itself seeming possible, and there is an indication of a resurgence of religious interest in a large section of the globe. Yet witnesses were assured that the predictions made on the basis of then current news reports were all evidences of God's revealing his confidential matters to a modern-day prophet organization, and that all witnesses had greater reason to go out boldly and confidently to proclaim this advance knowledge from God. Anyone reading the Bible can see that God's prophets were never inspired to speak a mixture of truth and error. Their statements needed no later additions that are corrected to wipe out or cover over false reasonings. Where then is there any true parallel? The organization seeks to robe itself in the awesome role of a prophet of God and claim the deference that such a prophetic office merits. Yet it disclaims the responsibility for accuracy that goes with the office. If confronted with God's words at Deuteronomy, chapter 18 verse 20 to 22 about such prophetic accuracy, it presumes to set this aside as not applying to it in its role of a genuine prophet, and authentic prophet class. By what right does it do so? Does merely saying, well, we're all imperfect, excuse the organization from having that biblical standard of a genuine prophet applied? It asks its adherents to disregard its past trail, which is strewn with unfulfilled predictions and now rejected erroneous interpretations, and to continue to put near reverential trust in what it publishes, granting it the dignity and honor and credence due a prophet of God. Instead of feeling humbled by the clear evidence of its erratic, zigzagging course, it becomes more strident in its claims, more dogmatic as to its pronouncements. Is this the course of a genuine prophet of God? Apostolic authority, apostolic power and authority are similarly self-assigned. On the one hand, the organization rejects the Catholic teaching of apostolic succession. Yet it asks its members to view it as if holding a similar position. The June 1, 1982, Watchtower, on page 17, in an article titled "Loyally Submitting to Theocratic Order," states, "Today, a remnant of this faithful slave is still alive on earth. Their duties include receiving and passing on to all of Jehovah's earthly servants spiritual food at the proper time. They occupy a position similar to that of Paul and his co-laborers when that apostle said of the wonderful truths God gives to his people, it is to us God has revealed them through his Spirit. 1 Corinthians, chapter 2 verse 9, 10. The organization in the above statement claims that, as the apostle Paul received revelations from God, so it is with the spiritual food the organization through its governing body now publishes, that it is to us God has revealed them through his Spirit. What Christian would want to be guilty of rejecting divinely revealed information from the apostle Paul? Who, then, would want to be guilty of rejecting information from this organization that claims to fulfill a parallel function? With reasoning of this kind, what need is there to make open claims to infallibility or divine inspiration? Similar to its describing itself as the Jeremiah class, the Ezekiel class, and the Elijah and Elisha class in attribution of prophetic office, the organization's 1988 publication Revelation, its grand climax at hand, regularly refers to the organization as the John class in attribution of an inferred apostolic office. The footnote reads, the October 1, 1967, Watchtower, page 592, urging submission to the visible organization, states that we must be in full and complete agreement with every feature of its apostolic procedure and requirements. End of footnote. The office is equally a self-appointed one with no evidence of any divine assignment. The footnote reads, as John R. Stott in his commentary on Galatians aptly puts it, the apostles were personally chosen, called, and commissioned by Jesus Christ, and authorized to teach in his name. There can, therefore, be no apostolic succession, other than a loyalty to the apostolic doctrine of the New Testament. The apostles had no successors. In the nature of the case no one could succeed them. They were unique. John R. Stott, Only One Way InterVarsity Press, Leicester/Downers Grove, 1968, page 13. End of footnote. Whoever sees us sees the heavenly Christ on pages 23, 24, the same issue of the Watchtower last quoted further exalts the position of the organization in this way. Since Christ Jesus is now the enthroned leader and commander of all fighters for truth and righteousness, we can unitedly learn from watching him as the 300 learned from watching Gideon. Judges, chapter 7 verse 17, but how can we today watch Christ, since he is invisible? We watch him in the sense that we discern his signals as given through his visible slave appointee over all the earthly interests of his kingdom. Matthew, chapter 24 verse 45 to 47, through this Spirit-appointed channel his direction and strategy are communicated to all who are his soldiers. These latter cannot afford to move ahead on their own or become impatient because their view of things is not coming to pass. The timing of matters is provided by our invisible commander. His view is the important consideration, not our own personal views. The organization in this goes far beyond filling the role of prophet and apostle. It here claims that what people see in it is the same as observing the invisible Christ himself giving signals. In effect they parallel Jesus' words that he that has seen me has seen the Father, for they clearly say that he that observes us is observing the Son. John, chapter 14 verse 9, the footnote reads, it is true that at Luke, chapter 10 verse 16 Jesus says, he that listens to you plural listens to me. Those words, however, were addressed to 70 disciples who were carrying the same gospel message he had preached, not some message of their own development. It is one thing to speak faithfully the words and message of Christ as preserved for us in the Scriptures. It is quite another to claim that, through some particular religious leadership acting as a governing body, Christ is now revealing things beyond what has there been written, claiming his backing for all the various rules, the predictions regarding certain dates, and the frequently changing interpretations of prophecies, applying these to certain periods or certain events in the organization's history. The ultimate effect is to make the Scriptures insufficient, incomplete, needing the organization to supply needed elements. End of footnote. Everyone knows what results to a soldier who fails to obey the orders and signals of his commanding officer. So who would think of disobeying the organization that one can look at as if looking at the messianic leader and commander Jehovah foretold? The footnote reads, Isaiah, chapter 55 verse 4. End of footnote. It seems nearly unbelievable that any could conceive of Jesus, as a commanding officer, sending directions in the form of the erratic, contradictory, shifting presentation of matters that has proceeded from the organization down through its history. But we are told that the view we get from that organization is the view of Christ himself, strategically timed by him. If the organization becomes mired down by holding to a wrong position for decades, we are to stagnate with it. If it heads off in a wrong direction, we are to go off on a tangent with it. The words of Revelation, chapter 14 verse 4, these are the ones that keep following the Lamb no matter where he goes, in actual fact convert into these are the ones that keep following the organization no matter where it goes. Mediatorship and priestly intervention, nor is even this the end. This and other articles urge that witnesses' attitude toward the organization should be like that shown to Moses and to the priesthood of Israel. Articles compare any who differ with the organization to those who rebelled against these special appointees of God. The footnote reads, see, for example, The Watchtowers of June 1, 1982, pages 17, 18, and September 1, 1982, page 13. End of footnote. It seems not to matter that the Bible shows that Jesus Christ, not some group of men, is alone the greater Moses, the foretold prophet like Moses to whom all must listen for salvation. The footnote reads, Acts, chapter 3 verse 20-23. End of footnote. Nor is consideration given to the fact that he eliminated the division between a priestly class and a non-priestly class, so that no one needs the intercession of any priest other than the one great high priest of God, Christ Jesus. The footnote reads, 1 Peter, chapter 2 verse 7-9, Hebrews, chapter 3 verse 1, 8 verse 1, 10 verse 19-22. End of footnote. The organization claims an analogy to Moses and the Aaronic priesthood, but the analogy proves untrue. It makes the claim but cannot produce the credentials. God made his selection of Moses as his mouthpiece and mediator clearly and undeniably evident to all by miraculous acts involved in Moses' selection and appointment, and God directly appointed the priesthood, accompanying its inauguration with divine acts of power to establish beyond doubt the validity of their appointment. The footnote reads, Exodus, chapter 4 verse 1-9, 20, 21, 33 verse 7-11, Leviticus, chapter 8 verse 1-13, 9 verse 22-24, Numbers, chapter 16 verse 1-35, 17 verse 1-10. End of footnote. The Watchtower organization is, by contrast, only self-assigned and self-authenticated as meriting the seat of unimpeachable authority it claims to hold. When one considers that the organization attributes to itself the role of prophet, apostle, spokesman for God, priestly representative, chief communications officer for the King of Kings and overseer of our souls, administrator of all Christ's interests on earth, director of all his household or congregation, it seems almost amusing, were it not so tragic, to read this paragraph in the June 1, 1982, Watchtower article on page 19. A mental attitude that must be guarded against is thinking more highly of ourselves than we ought to think. Romans, chapter 12 verse 3, that could lead a Christian into believing that he has a special mission from God apart from the channel through which Jehovah dispenses his truths and directs his household. It would, in effect, place him in a supposed special relationship with Jehovah not enjoyed by any other brother or sister in the household. But that sort of isolation can lead only to folly. One isolating himself will seek his own selfish longing, against all practical wisdom he will break forth. Proverbs, chapter 18 verse 1. As has been earlier shown, in the final analysis the governing body is the real organization, the channel. All the things said of the faithful and discreet slave class and the authority attributed to it relate primarily to the small group of about a dozen men composing the body. They are the ultimate beneficiaries of all this proclamation of importance of position and calls for submission. How governing body members, who, of all witnesses hold a position so obviously exclusive, with prerogatives and powers that certainly imply a very special relationship with Jehovah not enjoyed by any other brother or sister in the household, who act as the chief executive body, legislature, and Supreme Court for all congregations earthwide, how these men can allow such statements as were just quoted to be published without blushing is something I cannot comprehend. How could any group of persons possibly think more highly of themselves than is evidenced by attributing to themselves all the exalted roles and authority just set forth? When analyzed, the paragraph just quoted is seen as in effect telling all the rank and file members, how could you ever think that you could have a relationship with God equal to what we have? Living in isolation. The material warns of the unbalancing effect of isolation. Of all Jehovah's Witnesses, no persons are more isolated from life as it is lived by ordinary persons, no persons are more vulnerable to an ivory tower syndrome, no persons are more protected from having their claims and decisions questioned, from having to face their questioners and answer directly and with proof, no persons are more detached from the problems and pressures of being family men, wage earners, homeowners, ordinary congregation members, than are the small group of men forming the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses. The footnote reads, unlike the Apostle Paul, none of them has done any secular work in decades. Some of them in half a century. Only one, now deceased, had the experience of rearing a child. End of footnote. The rulings they make, often after only an hour or so of discussion, usually have little impact on their own lives but can have enormous effect on the lives of average witnesses. They plainly take the position that they are beyond correction or instruction by anyone other than God and Christ. As the February 1, 1952, Watchtower, pages 79, 80, put it, Jehovah and Christ direct and correct the slave as needed, not we as individuals. If we do not see a point at first, we should keep trying to grasp it, rather than opposing and rejecting it and presumptuously taking the position that we are more likely to be right than the discreet slave. We should meekly go along with the Lord's theocratic organization and wait for further clarification. They thus place themselves far above correction or instruction by ordinary fellow Christians, by any brother or sister in the household. Yet they unblushingly warn others against the dangers of an isolated, self-important viewpoint. It seems almost ludicrous that, in articles so loaded with self-approval, self-praise and self-glorification, the organization can simultaneously accuse as prideful any who conscientiously believe that this praise and reverence given to men should rightly be given only to God and Christ, and who are appalled at the idea of humans assuming the seat of exalted superiority over fellow Christians that the organization self-assertively assigns to itself. This is not to say that no others in the organization derive a certain degree of power from these claims. When the governing body, as the administrative part of the faithful and discreet slave class, claims to speak for God and Christ, then clearly those who speak for it, as headquarters personnel who hold some administrative position, branch representatives, traveling overseers, even elders, all receive a sort of radiated aura of authority as well, placing them as distinct and in a special relationship to God, via the governing body, not enjoyed by the average witness. Frequently these men are quick to remind any not responding to their direction that they represent the governing body, and thus they make the weight of their authority felt. The footnote reads, Matthew, chapter 20 verse 25, the New English Bible. See also quoted statements by Watchtower representatives and former traveling overseers in pages 188, 189, 195, 196, 198 to 200, 212, 213. End of footnote. It would be worthwhile to review the methods men in the 2nd and 3rd centuries employed to awe others with the importance of their superior position, superior relationship with God and Christ, as discussed in chapter 3 of this publication. That review should make evident that the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses has not only gone as far as those early bishops, it has in many respects gone farther. Not until the arrival of the papacy can claims of such exclusive ecclesiastical authority be found to match those published in the Watchtower magazine. The claims of the papacy relate to authority vested in a single man, the claims of the Watchtower organization relate to authority vested in a small group of men. The papacy presents itself as the vicegerent of Christ on earth, in effect, the appointed manager or administrative deputy of Christ. The leadership of the Watchtower organization does not use the term vicegerent but describes itself as the one and only steward whom Christ has, since 1919, assigned the direction and administration of all his interests on earth. It is a distinction without a difference, for only the terminology differs. The claim is the same. Coupled with the program of constant indoctrination, the ultimate effect of all this organizational posturing is intellectual intimidation. Witnesses are subtly made to feel that they should distrust their own thinking and judgment when they read the Bible, that they should distrust their own heart and its motivation, and that no matter how conscientiously they may seek to apply God's word they should distrust their conscience as being a sound guide. Their trust should be in the organization. They must march in lockstep with it. To follow the leading of Christ and of Holy Spirit in any other direction would be to run ahead of God. End of chapter 12.